everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce my friend Michael Weiner, who will be presenting tonight on the topic of Generals of the Mexican War, which is also the topic of his first place winning paper from the current year. And hopefully we'll have those out in print soon, very soon, very soon. Michael, take it away.
Thank you, Jason. All right. So I'm going to talk about a conflict that I didn't know anything about until I started collecting some of the medals. This is an expanded version of a talk that I gave to an online group in September called World of Coins, which was kind of interesting because it was people from all over. There were a lot of Indians from India there and in part of that group, and so it was something they hadn't heard of either. And you may not have heard of the Mexican-American War of 1846. It's an interesting conflict and really shaped the destinies of both the United States and Mexico. So, naturally, one would like to know what are some of the causes. Well, like anything, it's complicated, but one of the direct causes was the annexation of Texas by the United States. Now, some years earlier, Texas had fought its War of Independence from Mexico, the Alamo and all that. And the Mexican government really didn't recognize that Texas was an independent country, the Republic of Texas. But they were sort of happy to let it go as long as Texas didn't become part of the United States. And so when Texas was annexed, this caused problems. And so, but there are other factors at play on the U.S. side. This idea of manifest destiny, which I do remember learning that in high school, which was basically that the United States would go all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But that wasn't the only thing. There also was the issue of slavery, of course, in the 1840s, and the Western expansion was motivated by some who had pro-slavery interests, and so adding slave states and free states, made it complicated. The Missouri Compromise was part of that. Oddly enough, given today's kind of politics, this war was supported by the Democrats and opposed by the Whigs, and the Whigs, of course, were the ones who became the Republican Party. And this was really, all related to what was coming, which was the American Civil War. But on the U.S. side. But like I was trying to allude to, that the perceptions are very different in our two countries. In our country, in the United States, it's largely forgotten. I asked my daughter, who's now quite a few years out of high school, were there any questions on the U.S. history AP test on the Mexican-American War? And she certainly didn't remember any, and if there were, she didn't get them right, unless she just guessed. But in Mexico, this war is well remembered, and I won't say the Spanish, but because I can't. But it translates as the first American intervention into Mexico, which implies that there was more than one, which of course there was. So what happened in this war? How did it turn out? They captured California, New Mexico, and most of northern Mexico. When Major General Winfield Scott, and we'll talk about him more later, finally made it to Mexico City, that forced the Mexicans to agree to terms specified by the U.S. with very little recourse. This was formulated in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that put the U.S.-Mexican border on the Rio Grande. That was part of the arguments prior to the war. Where did Texas end and Mexico begin? And they had put it on a different river farther north. But also as part of this treaty, the United States got Texas, California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and not New Mexico twice. So most of the Western United States became part of the United States as as a result of this war. Um, it had been Mexico, and in fact, the treaty, I think, rather deliberately put 51% of Mexican territory into the United States. And Mexico did get something for this, not arguably not enough. They got about $18 million plus some forgiven debt, mostly to Texans. And this was interesting, about half what the United States made prior to the war to settle the Texas question. And then Mexican land grants were recognized by the U.S., but of course, people who study California history know that these really weren't recognized, and this part was ignored. So, my daughter and other students in California do learn about the beginnings of California as part of the United States, and they may have learned about some of the battles that were fought in Southern California and Fremont and Vallejo. But these battles that were in California involved a couple hundred combatants. But the one in Mexico, the actual war in Mexico, was a major conflict with tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides and large military operations, some of which are kind of interesting. And in fact, there were two separate U.S. armies, and I'll talk a little more detail about this. The first one, commanded by Major General Zachary Taylor, who invaded northeast Mexico from Texas. I'll show you some maps in a minute. And then later, Major General Winfield Scott and his army invaded Mexico City, landing at Veracruz to do that. The Mexican army had a number of generals. Partway into it, in the early part of it, um, uh, uh, Santa Anna, who had been exiled, made a plea to come in and make peace, and instead he actually increased the conflict. And he used this to reestablish his command and one of his many presidencies. He was president many times, not consecutively. So here's a picture of Taylor. Um, the Battle of Buena Vista is going to be one of the medals and of historical importance, and it was the last one in northern Mexico. And basically, at this point, all of northern Mexico was under U.S. control, and it was much celebrated in the U.S. And I'll show you a little more about that in a minute. During the course of the war, he was actually awarded 3 Congressional Gold Medals. Now, Congressional Gold Medals are medals awarded by Act of Congress. He's the only person to actually have received 3 of these. And this particular battle of Buena Vista propelled him to win the presidency in 1848 after the war was over. But his presidential ambitions were not unknown, and Polk, who was the president, was aware of these ambitions, and so after he got to Buena Vista, he was ordered to remain there, and that's when Winfield Scott was sent in. Partly because it probably made some strategic sense, but in large part to stifle the growing popularity of Taylor. Taylor was officially a Whig, which, remember, I told you that they actually opposed this war, but he wasn't a very good Whig. He ignored most of the party's platform, and he died after 18 months in office, probably from the of intestinal problems, and probably was related to rather poor water quality in the city of Washington at the time. So let's talk about the Taylor's medals and the battle. So you can see here Corpus Christi. This is um, where uh, 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 Taylor was sent originally, and because this border here was the contested part that Mexico had thought wanted to be the border, and Texas was saying, well, no, it should be down here at the Rio Grande. And after the annexation of Texas, uh, Taylor knew this army, the Mexican army, had come up that way, and he sent emissaries saying, "Look, don't cross over because if you do, I'm going to have to retaliate." And he didn't really want to do that, but they did, and so then the Taylor marched his army into Mexico, and he confronted them in this town of Palo Alto, um, relatively early on, and then they basically chased him into another town, Resaca de Palma, and and for so Taylor's first gold medal was awarded for his victories in these two places. So the Mexican army was part of the deal was that Taylor let the Mexican army, rather than being captured, he let them retreat, and he got some grief for that, and they retreated to the town of Monterrey, and so he had to go there and with his army, and this was um, an urban war, and originally they weren't doing so. The U.S. wasn't doing so well, but eventually their superior numbers caused them to prevail. Now, this is when Polk told Taylor, he was again awarded a gold medal for this. So he was popular in Congress. He was popular in the populace. And Taylor then said, "Okay, you've done enough. Stay there in Monterey." And and Taylor really didn't think it was very defensible to stay in the city, and so he moved to this place, um, which some people call Buena Vista. It was basically high ground, and so more easily defended. And that's what we'll talk about next. Oh, but here's the medals. Um, Actually, his gold medals were kept by the family until after Hurricane Katrina, and after the hurricane, they decided they would sell them. Apparently, there were some issues with the bank and the deposit box, and so here's one of the gold. These are all sold by stacks. This is the first one, the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de Palma. It's cataloged by Julian as MI-22. That MI stands for military. Um, and it has a bust of Taylor on the one side, and then the words "Resolution of Congress" with the date July 16th, 1846, Palo Alto, and May 8th, 1846, Resaca de Palma. The resolution rather is on July, and the battles were May 8th and May 9th. And then the Monterey medal is basically the same obverse and similar on the back. It just it has a different date and says Monterey, and a different date for the congressional resolution, and a different date for the battle. So let's get on to Buena Vista, and this is where it starts to get interesting. So you recall that Taylor was ordered to stay in Monterey, but instead he chose Buena Vista. He had more than 10,000 troops in Monterey, but Polk then took half of them away. In fact, he took the experienced half away, and most of the ones Taylor was left with were volunteers, and sent them down to meet Winfield Scott to conquer southern Mexico, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And so he had mostly just light artillery, and he was in this pass on the high ground, and Santa Anna had spies, of course, and one of his spies got wind of the fact that most of Taylor's army was not there anymore and was on the way down to Veracruz to meet Scott. And so, in a rather bold move, he marched his 15,000 troops through the desert, losing many of them to desertion, because it was pretty awful. I guess it was hot, even though it's winter. Um, and and he arrived um, at the bottom of the hill, I guess, and send a message up. Well, I got you surrounded. you need you need to surrender, and Taylor, of course, refused. And the next day, the battle ensued for 10 hours. And at the end of the battle, a bunch of guys got killed on both sides, which is usually what happens in these things. And but there was not a lot of movement as far as who was where. Um, and so the next day, Santa Anna did not attack again, and even though it was expected. And this is partly because of this of the forced march across the desert, and partly I suspect because the battle was so inconclusive. Um, and so both sides declared victory and withdrew. Now, what's interesting about and Santa Anna withdrew, and Taylor declared victory as well, and much was made of that, which we'll see. Um, Oddly enough, though, the U.S. was not in good shape at this point, and the books that I've read on this suggest that he was unlikely to survive another day, certainly not 2 more days of a battle of this magnitude. Um, so history might have been very different, but it is what it is. And so here is Taylor's medal. I mentioned that that they were sold by Stax after the Hurricane Katrina. That Taylor's family still and descendants apparently still in Louisiana. And this is the medal that attracted me to this, just because of the detail on the reverse. Now, obviously, I didn't buy the gold medal. This was sold for $406,000 in 2006. Um, it is engraved by C.C. Wright, who was an accomplished engraver. The you get the sense that there's thousands and thousands of soldiers here. And in fact, I think this is supposed to be Taylor right here. There are some things I don't completely understand. Now it's got the date, Buena Vista, 1847, and the resolution of Congress in 1848. I don't actually understand these snakes, and maybe we can talk about that. The one that's attacking is a rattlesnake. You see the rattle down here. It goes like this. There you go. So that's the rattlesnake. And so it's been suggested that that's the U.S. snake, and then the other one's a Mexican snake, but I don't really know. Now, fortunately, they struck this in the 19th century and again in the 20th century in bronze. This is a 19th century example, it's not particularly rare. Um, it, it's it's kind of rare to see them like this. It's in really good shape. But I think it's a very attractive metal. The 20th century version is less attractive. It's not the chocolate bronze, but rather the lighter golden bronze that they used to sell down at the Granite Lady before the mint abandoned it. Here's some of the details. Um, so I think this one is supposed to be no, here's Taylor right here. This is Taylor right here with the hat on, blowing a horn. And you can see, it's just, it's a very large metal. It's 89.5 millimeters, and so there's plenty of room to make a scene like this. You can see the battlefield smoke and cannons and people getting shot at. And I wanted to go back just so you see the mountains here. This is the part of the canyon, and presumably these are the Mexicans down here in the U.S. up here on the high ground. So, um, Taylor's victory, that he declared was much celebrated. Santa Anna, of course, also declared victory and took and captured some cannon, which apparently are still on display in a museum somewhere in Mexico. I don't know where. But there were a lot of prints, which were popular at this time, and especially in a patriotic sense, and some of them were used as the presidential campaign. But most importantly, for our purposes here, is the reverse of the medal may have actually been taken from one of these prints. Unfortunately, the artist is a F.A. Smith, and nothing's known about who this person might have been. But here are some of these prints. This one sort of looks like the back of the medal. I mean, you got, thousands of troops down here. You got the canyon. Presumably one of these is Taylor, I guess. This was published a couple of years afterwards, but some of them were about the time when the medal was being engraved. This one I only put in because I actually own this one. I bought this for a whole $5 on eBay. You got Taylor here and some guys who have not done so well in this battle, and these mountains. So again, it's sort of similar to the medal. And then here's another one, where it's actually, I think they ripped each other off all the time. You got the wounded up here in the front and Taylor on the horse with a different hat. There's more smoke in this one. But this one's interesting because the inscription on it says, "A little more grape, Captain Bragg." And I copied this from Wikipedia, but this is actually pretty well known that this guy Bragg, Captain Bragg, had been ordered to maintain his position at all costs, quote. And Taylor went over there and found out he wasn't using single canister shots, so he was only he could put more lead in these things, and so Taylor ordered to double shot your guns and give them hell, Bragg. And this got misquoted as "give them a little more grape." Grape were the small projectiles that they would have put in a cannon that were particularly deadly, sort of like a shotgun kind of thing. So let's move on to Scott. Now, Scott was known for having a fancy uniform and being very pompous, and his nickname was Old Fuss and Feathers. And he was considerably older than Taylor. He was actually awarded a Congressional Gold Medal in the War of 1812. And also, like Taylor, he ran for president, but he lost. So what did Scott do? So Scott landed with the Marines at Veracruz, right here. And what's not on this map is presumably Taylor's men that had been ordered by Polk to meet up at Veracruz. Must have marched down the coast, but I don't actually know the details of that. So once Scott and this rather large army took Veracruz, they proceeded to march all the way to eventually Mexico City, taking having conflicts along the way, most of which did not last particularly long. One of the more important ones is this one at Chapultepec. I had to get that right. Chapultepec, maybe. Somebody will correct me on that because I know some of you guys speak Spanish. Although this is actually probably an Indian name, and I'll talk about that in a bit. So that's what Scott did. Once he got to Mexico City, Taylor and the other armies up in the northern Mexico had all of northern Mexico, and Scott had most of southern Mexico, and so the country was defeated. Mexico was defeated, and the treaty had to be negotiated. And so here's Scott's medal. Now it's the same size. It's 89.5 millimeters. It's arguably also cut by C.C. Wright, arguably not quite as artistic as the on the back. The fronts are more or less the same. In that it's kind of busy because what it has is basically all those battles that I showed you on here are represented on this on the reverse, with the middle being Scott in Mexico City. It says here City of Mexico here, but each one of these is a battle. This was Veracruz, and it goes on and on. It's also an interesting medal, no doubt about it. I think it in itself, and because the same size, I guess things. Congress is treating the two of them equally. Here's the detail. Here's Scott in Mexico City, having conquered it. So let's talk a little bit about what happened with this. So Congress voted on May 9th, 1848, to give gold medals to these two. Scott's it didn't say BV here, but Scott's medal is in the Smithsonian Institution. sometimes on display. And Taylor's big metal sold for $460,000. Um, uh, um, Q. David Bowers thought it should be worth more, like $1 million, but half a million is still a lot of money. The other two were reasonably bargains at the price, I guess. $37,000 for one of the, I forget which one, the Monterey or the Resaca del Palma. Um, and then the more recent sale was almost three times that. Um, like I mentioned, it was large metal. Only Grant's 1863 medal of these congressional gold medals was larger. For Vicksburg was 105 millimeters, which is sort of like approaching dinner plate kind of size. Interestingly, Taylor's medal was made first, and by the time it was actually had been engraved and dies made, he was indeed the president, and it was there's documentary evidence that tells us that the gold was from the first private deposit of California gold um, to um, to the Philadelphia Mint, made by David Carter, a day before the U.S. military deposited the gold that the 1848 Quarter Eagles counterstamped with Cal were made. So it's has yet another connection to California. As I mentioned, the dies were engraved by Charles Cushing Wright. Um, and that part of that for these two big gold medals was that it was external to the mint, because the other two that Taylor had been given were criticized as being rather boring, which they kind of are. The obverses were from a sculptor who did a bas-relief portrait of these two, Salathiel Ellis, and so his name is as DEL, or I'm not sure that's Latin. I can't say that either. Delinivet or something, or he drew it. Um, as I mentioned, Taylor's reverse was from an unknown author. It says that F.A. Smith drew it. And Scott's reverse is signed by G.C. Humphreys, and he was an officer who was actually there, and an artist, and some books of him, some picture books of military uniforms survive that he drew. So this is now into the stuff that's not in the article. This is more recent stuff that I've been looking at. There are two other important medals for each one for each of these generals by their respective states. Now Taylor's from Louisiana, and this was actually authorized before the Buena Vista medal, and was struck in gold. For him, and it has the pelican, which is a symbol for Louisiana, on the one side, and then again a battle scene with him here at the front of Buena Vista, and so it says Buena Vista right on it. This was not struck by the Mint. It's a little bit smaller. It's 76 millimeters. It was also struck in silver, which I can't find any evidence the others were struck in silver. Stack says there are about 15 of these. This is by far the nicest one. This is one from the Ford collection, and then they were struck in bronze. This metal is relatively scarce, and in bronze typically sells for more than the other ones that we've seen. But it's pretty nicely done metal, actually. Like I said, I've never seen one in silver. I've seen them in bronze. I don't have one though. And then Scott was awarded one in 1850 by Virginia, where he was from. This one is again big. It's essentially the same size. I think it's really 89.5 millimeters. Cataloged by Julian as MI-27. This was authorized by an executive order of the governor of Virginia, and was indeed struck by the United States Mint, and is another handsome medal. In this chocolate bronze. The request by the governor was to do one in gold, one in silver, and 25 in bronze. And the 25 is certainly not true. I mean, there are hundreds of these. It's not a common metal, but it's not It's not a rare nor expensive by the standards of these kinds of 19th century military medals. Um, I don't collect these, but I thought I'd just say it's another way of how these two guys were remembered. They both ran for president. Taylor won, Scott did not. These are campaign tokens from 1852 the two individuals. And interesting, the Scott one is sort of like his medal. It's got all these different um, battles on the back. This is a very highly collected kind of thing, a series. And I don't know much about it, but I do know that there are a lot of different varieties of these things. Now, what about Santa Anna? We've only talked about American generals. Well, if you lose, no one's going to make you a medal. But Santa Anna did have some medals made. There actually are two different ones from the 1830s. Um, and I think these medals are far rarer than any of the Taylor or Scott medals. I could only find these two in auction records. This one has been sold 3 times, but I can tell it's the same one by the marks. Um, like I said, he was as Wikipedia said, an enigmatic, patriotic, but controversial figure um, who was in had a political career spanning over 40 years. Um, but he did not remain a popular person, I think, in today's Mexican history. So what I want to just circle back on is perspectives in history, and history is part of it is story, and how you tell that story, and perspectives I think are really different in our two countries. I mean, I think if you ask people in the United States, a lot of people would say, what do you know about the Mexican War? And they would say, what, we fought a war with Mexico? It's just not something I think is in our collective consciousness, or at least not at a high level. But in Mexico, this war was very important, and it's an important part of their history. I refer back to the name, the common name of it in Mexico. And indeed, I mean, there are. I mentioned that these cannons that Santana captured are still on display. But more importantly, one of the battles that they lost is a national holiday, the Dia de los Niños Heroes, the boy heroes. Um, and this goes. Here's a picture from Scott's medal of this particular battle at Chapultepec. Is that right? There was a castle there, an old castle, and the castle was being used as a military academy. The Nino heroes died. There were, I think, 6 of them um, in this battle, and some of them may be legendary, but many consider them to be martyrs, fighting to maintain Mexico's honor. And they're both brave and innocent because of their youth. Whereas the Mexican army generals, particularly Santa Anna, were blamed for this defeat, which maybe there might be some politicians involved in that blame as well. So the Mexican War resulted in a very large increase in U.S. territory. Most of the West, certainly where I'm sitting right now, at the expense of Mexico. And like I mentioned, it's not well remembered here, but it certainly is there. And it could have gone very differently if Santa Anna, maybe he really was incompetent, that he didn't recognize that he had severely um, weakened Taylor's position, and counterattacked the next day. It could have been very different. So some of these pictures I got from Stacks, and if you want more detail, of course, read the article, and Wikipedia was useful. Wikipedia really helped me understand the relationship between the different battles. There's a lot of really good stuff written about this there, and also referring to other articles. And I'll end with this monument to the Nino heroes, and take questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael.